For an information session for another group. We have a few more sessions, two happening next week for coastal communities and for jurisdictions over 10,000 outside of the metro region. So just checking to make sure everyone's in the right place. And then we also have another session happening October 20th for cities under 10,000. And hold on just a moment as I share my screen. Okay. So the purpose of this information session is to share information on the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, and in particular, the draft rule amendments for Division 7, 8, 21, and 24. For this session we'll, in particular, be focusing on Division 8, which is interpretation of Goal 10 housing. And there will be opportunities to ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll pause throughout so you all have a chance to ask your questions and to help inform your review of the rules if you haven't reviewed them already, and hopefully public comment. And to start, I think we'll do a quick round of intros of DLCD staff. And so for me, my name is Jenna Hughes. I'm a housing and growth management analyst with DLCD's housing division. And I will pass it to Celestina to introduce herself.
Good afternoon, everybody. Celestina Teva, she and they pronouns, and I am a housing planner also in the housing division here at DLCD. And if we want to do everyone who's on the call, is that what you were thinking, Jenna?
Let's do our regional reps for the Portland Metro region. I see Kelly is on the call.
Over to you, Kelly.
Hi, everyone. Kelly Reed, regional rep. I'll pass it over to Laura.
Hey, everyone. Laura Kelly, also regional rep. Jenna.
Great. And I know we have several other folks on the DLCD team on the call, and that includes Madeline Phillips, Karan Gijan Chapman, Samuel Goldberg, and then we also have Ingrid Caudell, our technical assistant for today. So if you have any technical issues, please contact Ingrid, and Journey, who is our note taker for today. If I miss anyone, please let me know. But I think that pretty much covers who's in the room. And great to see some familiar names of from you all. And hopefully there will be an opportunity for you all to introduce yourselves as you ask questions. So starting with just right off the bat, I wanted to make sure that everyone is aware that we are currently in a public comment period for the draft rules for the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis. The window is open now through November 7th, and you can send comments to the email address on this slide or verbally at the LCDC hearing happening on October 23rd. The exact time is TBD, but we'll send a follow-up email with the link both to the draft rules and these details, so you have that. And we'll also be sending a recording of the session, as some folks have requested a recording for those who couldn't make it today. So we'll start with an overview of what the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis is and some background. And then we'll go into an overview of some of the major changes being proposed through this year's rulemaking. And we'll pause for questions throughout, and then we will close out with next steps. So beginning with the overview of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, or the OHNA, which is the first major update to Goal 10 housing. And the OHNA policy was passed in 2023 by the Oregon legislature through House Bill 2001. And the OHNA directs DLCD to develop administrative rules and guidance for supporting local governments in implementing Goal 10 and increasing housing production, affordability, and choice. So under Goal 10 implementation, this is done in 3 main phases outlined on this slide. The first is the determination of housing need. So this is where each city gets a housing production target, which is that short-term housing goal, 6 years for the metro region, as well as a 20-year housing allocation. And this comes from the Department of Administrative Services. So this is one of the first major changes under OHNA. And then from there, jurisdictions will determine which housing types, characteristics, and locations are needed in their community. And that is done through the contextualized housing need. The second phase involves estimating capacity of the land to determine whether there is enough land to accommodate the housing need over a 20-year planning period. And in this, something new, which I'll talk about a little bit later, is what is called a development-ready land inventory. And so this is a new inventory to help bring together public facilities planning and land use planning. Also in this second phase is the housing production strategy, which is where a city will take actions to address their housing needs and any fair housing issues. And then that third column on the right is involves monitoring and reporting on the progress of those actions. So last year, LCDC, the Land Conservation and Development Commission, adopted rules to establish a housing acceleration program in order to support cities who are falling behind on their targets. And we're currently in the process of our current draft rules specifically speak to housing capacity and urbanization and compliance pathways for the housing production strategy and acceleration program. So as I mentioned, some rules were adopted last year, but for the 2025 scope, DLCD is tasked with developing rules to clarify methodologies and assumptions for estimating the capacity of land, creating greater clarity and certainty for UGB amendments, land exchanges, and urban and rural reserves, coordinating land use and public facilities planning, and this includes assessing the development readiness of land, and then also developing adoption-ready actions and model codes to help with implementation of housing production strategies, creating pathways for local governments to comply with the requirements in the HPS and acceleration program. And lastly, developing guidance, including a Goal 10 guidebook and a revamp of our housing production strategy menu of actions. And the rules included in this scope must be adopted by January 1st of 2026, but we will continue to develop guidance to support implementation through next year. So in 2023, the LCDC adopted this racial equity framework for decision making, which DLCD is required to use in all rulemaking efforts. This tool includes 8 components that are outlined here on this slide. And these are really intended to center people who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color when making decisions to ensure equitable outcomes. And we lead with race because of, especially because of the disproportionate impacts communities of color experience when it comes to housing outcomes. But we do also take an intersectional approach to ensure that we are lifting up other marginalized identities through this framework. And I also want to note that this is not just a responsibility of DLCD staff. We have also asked our rulemaking advisory committee and our technical advisory committees to share responsibility of using this tool throughout our rulemaking process. Touching on the timeline for this project, we kicked off this rulemaking back in 2023 and adopted phase 1 of rules at the end of 2024. And I mentioned earlier, but the rule adoption deadline is January 1st of 2026. So we're now at the last quarter of this process, and a key place to provide feedback to inform final rules. Before we get into more of the nuts and bolts of what's included in the draft rules, I want to pause to see if there are any questions before we move forward on anything I've said so far. Teresa.
I'm just wondering, you mentioned the Goal 10 guidebook and the revamp of the housing production strategies. Are those things that will be worked on through next year then versus being done now?
That's a great question. Celestina was actually going to talk about that later, but I'm wondering if you want to touch on that now.
Yeah, absolutely, Jenna. We have already released out in our Housing Actions Work Group packets for comment, which is available to everybody, right, online, and we can make sure that we have links for you all to look around for our materials. But the short answer is we have a draft menu of actions available for comment right now that will continue to be refined and is planned to be adopted along with the rest of the rules because the HPS menu is an attachment to the rules. So that is slated for completion on the same timeline as the draft rules. And then the guidebook is not bound to those timelines. We do have some work plans that do result in finishing up the Goal 10 guidebook around the new year as well. But there is some flexibility there, especially if we want to make refinements based on some of the final rules that get adopted. Does that answer your question on those two pieces?
Yes, thanks.
Great.
Right, I'm not seeing any other hands up, but there will be more opportunities to ask questions. So I think we will keep going. Celestina, I think I will pass it on to you to start.
Sounds great. I think we have one high-level slide just to start to orient to all of the programmatic topics we'll be covering today. So we've got the contextualized housing need, which really underpins the rest of Goal 10 planning. And then the housing capacity analysis, including land use efficiency measures and the development ready land inventory Jenna was just mentioning. She'll be covering both of those. I'll start us off with the contextualized housing need, and then we'll be touching on the housing production strategy and housing acceleration program. So that's just a little orientation. And I think with that, we can jump right in. Okay, so we're going to refer back to that diagram that Jenna presented earlier in overviewing Goal 10 throughout this presentation, just to continue to try and orient since there are new elements that have been added under OHNA. And that first third is where we are determining housing need. And I should just rename one more time that our presentation today is really geared toward the draft rules that are at hand, but I will also be incorporating some review essentially of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis paradigm writ large. So to review, this first step of determining housing need includes both the new Oregon Housing Needs Analysis methodology, which is a statewide process for estimating and allocating housing need. That is a statewide process. However, the methodology works at a regional level and then is distributed down to local governments, both in a 20-year housing need allocation, which informs the housing capacity analysis, as well as a 6 or 8-year housing production target, which is similar but weighted a little bit differently for use in the housing production strategy portion of the program. But that methodology and what it yields is simply the number of housing units that are needed by affordability bracket. So while very helpful and a really big change in terms of how we understand need, because the methodology really tries to understand current and future need rather than basing it off of past production trends. Ultimately, it still leaves a lot left to be understood about really the quality and the details of housing need in any given local government. And so that's where the contextualized housing need comes in. And it looks like actually we have a little error in this diagram where it says needed housing. That title right there should be contextualized housing need. And that's the step in the process where the local government takes that needed housing allocation and the housing production target, that number of units by affordability, and teases that out some more and says, okay, well, what do we know about the types of housing that we need in our community, the characteristics of housing, further details, and the locations for both types and characteristics. Where in our communities do we have different kinds of needs? And so in the rules that were adopted last year, that light blue portion is what I'm referencing on the diagram. I'm sorry, I'll pause for a moment to name that the dark blue is primarily state-led efforts, and the light blue is local. So that localized portion of the work, the contextualized housing need, has what we call base rules that were adopted in 2024 that guide that work and orient it to really the objective of affirmatively furthering fair housing. So understanding local housing needs includes a fair housing issue area analysis, where different elements of fair housing need to be explored and evaluated with community input and guidance. And then the work of this year, as Jenna mentioned, was to really develop compliance pathways, so specific and more predictable elements of the program in terms of what kinds of conclusions local government should be finding in this process. So on the next slide, I will talk a little bit about that, and I will introduce what we call compliance tools. So one thing that I want to name out at the start here as we're introducing this idea of compliance pathways is that throughout the whole Goal 10 process, one of the things that has been really clear in the rulemaking this year is that what has been developed are what we call partial compliance pathways. And so what that means is you can see in the diagram on the right that the charge of the contextualized housing need is broader, and the obligation to really understand local needs extends beyond some of these key needs that have additional regulation or support really to find compliance. And I'll outline what those key needs are in a moment, but I'm just going to unpack that one more step to explain what we mean by really compliance pathways. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the 3 different compliance tools that are currently part of the draft rules. And I'll break each of them down. So the first one is a safe harbor tool. This is one that you all may be particularly familiar with because it exists in other types of planning regulation. And at its essence, it's a may rule. So it means that a local government may, fulfill any given rule requirement using this path. And if so, that local government will be assured compliance. Then there's a rebuttable presumption, which is a little bit stronger in terms of sort of program predictability and prescription, because it is more of an expectation that a local government must conduct this portion of the rule in this way unless an alternative can be demonstrated to more effectively meet the intent of a given rule. And in this case, it's usually identifying housing needs or meeting housing needs. And then lastly, you'll see minimum standards, which you'll also be familiar with. Rebuttable presumption is one that some folks are familiar with and some aren't, but the minimum standard is more common as it's just as simple as a must, right? It's a requirement, it's a minimum standard that's being introduced. And in the application of the contextualized housing need, that means it would be a minimum standard for how to identify certain housing needs at the local level. And with that, we can go to the next slide and take a look more substantively at the compliance pathways that are currently included in the draft rules. So you'll see those 3 different compliance tools in the columns, and then you'll see the key needs here on the left-hand side of the table representing the rows. And those are the key needs that, after working this year and informed extensively by rulemaking efforts last year as well, that are included in draft rule because they are both, we know them to be very important in order to meet local housing need. And there are also ways to begin to understand them on a statewide level where it could be worth bringing a compliance pathway forward. Whereas other needs, which may be and usually are equally as important, may be more challenging to identify at a state level with statewide data sets and things of that nature. So that's a little bit about how those key needs were identified. And then you'll see that the draft rules use different levels of prescription for different key needs. And that's again based on that thinking of varying data environments, really. So some of these key needs may have a more clear path forward in terms of local conditions being understood at a state level or with statewide data sets. And others, we may still be collectively in development of understanding how we could measure, for example, adaptable housing on a wide scale. And so for those items, a safe harbor that's more optional is what is included in the draft rules. You'll see there's only one item that is a minimum standard in this list, and you'll see the note that the affordable homeownership need actually was largely legislated in the 2025 session. Legislature adopted statewide homeownership goals. And so the program and the draft rules essentially uses that and applies that to Goal 10 housing. And then you'll see in white the source of each of the specifics for the compliance pathways for each of these needs. So, we didn't mention at the top that we will recap the resources for this work at the end. And we didn't mention at the top that they're included in the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis rollout are the Housing Production Dashboard and the Housing Equity Indicator Dashboard. So those dashboards contain quite a bit of information about housing needs and housing production. And so where you see equity indicators referenced here, the compliance pathways have been built to draw on data that's available there. And that is my overview of this one, Jenna. So I think we've got a question slide. We can toggle back to either of those slides if helpful, and open for Q&A. Yes, Teresa?
I'll be that person. Um,
Great.
so on the dashboards, I know at one point, metro counties are new to all of this. I know most cities have a sense of this. They've done some of this in the past, even though it's changed. Metro counties are, so us and Clackamas are completely new to it. And we will need maybe more handholding than other jurisdictions. And I know at one point we weren't yet included in the dashboards, or information for us wasn't in there. And we won't be able to do that ourselves. So I'm just wondering the status of that work.
Yeah, absolutely, Teresa. I believe February is the release date for the first update of the dashboard. If I'm off by a month plus or minus, forgive me, or if the work plan changes a little bit for Oregon Housing and Community Services, but I know that early 26 is when that dashboard will be updated, and including the metro counties is at the top of the list.
Great.
All right, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I think we will move on to the next piece, which is the housing capacity analysis. Um, so the housing capacity analysis, formerly you may have called this the housing needs analysis, but this is the analysis where a jurisdiction will determine whether they have enough land zoned to sufficient capacity within an urban growth boundary to accommodate 20 years of housing need. And the process for completing a housing capacity analysis, or HCA, is a little different under OHNA, and hopefully a little bit simpler, because instead of determining your own housing need, that work is already done before you get to this point, because you'll be using that allocated housing need from DAS and contextualizing it to get to the needed housing types, and then plugging that information in here, and comparing that with the buildable land inventory. So to reiterate, part of our rulemaking charge is, again, to increase clarity and legal certainty for local governments, including refining buildable land inventory, or BLI, methodologies. So these draft rules aim to do that in a few ways. From an organizational standpoint, we've proposed to repeal Division 7 entirely, which is the Metropolitan Housing Division. DLCD staff recognized, as we were comparing Division 7 and Division 8, which is the interpretation of Goal 10 housing, there was a lot of duplication between those two divisions. And with the changes from OHNA, a lot of Division 7 was just obsolete. So Division 8 now is the sole statewide Goal 10 division for administrative rules. So hopefully that will be a lot simpler going forward, with just having to review rules in one division going forward. And we've also consolidated all housing capacity analysis rules under Division 8, that's Rule 100, and also reconciled some safe harbors for BLIs that previously appeared only in Division 24, which is our urban growth boundary division. So you'll notice a lot of, for those who maybe have recently looked at our rules, you'll notice some organizational changes there. Getting into the content of the rules, we've added a new definition for partially vacant land, and provided a safe harbor to help identify an inventory capacity of partially vacant parcels. Some of what we heard throughout this rulemaking, and even just before this rulemaking, was a desire to reduce a lot of that phantom capacity, or paper capacity, which overestimates how much capacity a city can actually count on to meet their need in 20 years. So the rules introduce an option to use what is called a land market supply factor. for estimating residential capacity of partially vacant land. And when applied, a land market supply factor allows a jurisdiction to estimate the percentage of buildable land that is likely to remain undeveloped over the course of the planning period, and discount that. And it could remain undeveloped for a variety of reasons, including fluctuating market factors or other factors beyond a city's control. And so this really just recognizes that, and also recognizes that partially vacant land is just more challenging to estimate. So having that flat discount can help reduce some of that analytical burden. And then I'll talk a little bit more about development readiness later in the presentation, but there is an added safe harbor to allow a third discount for each housing capacity analysis cycle that a lot that is identified as development ready hasn't developed or experienced infill. And if a jurisdiction is not using the safe harbor, they must discount the capacity of these development ready lots that haven't developed by 50% after 2 HCA cycles and 100% after 3 HCA cycles. In 2026, after these rules are adopted, we'll also be developing guidance to support implementation of the rules, and that will include resources, example methodologies, and best practices. So in the housing capacity analysis, or HCA, in comparing that housing need to existing capacity, if the existing capacity is sufficient to meet that need, no further action is required, except for the actions to address the unmet needs in a housing production strategy. And if it's insufficient, this will look a little bit differently for metro and non-metro jurisdictions. Non-metro jurisdictions obviously have the option to respond to a land deficiency through a UGB amendment. Metro cities don't have this option. So the response to a deficiency in this case would be through taking actions to increase capacity for needed housing. And those actions we are calling land use efficiency measures. This land use efficiency measures aren't a new concept, but it's something that hasn't previously been defined before. So the draft rules do propose a definition for land use efficiency measures. And land use efficiency measures are a subset of a type of HPS action. So they're one type of action that a city could include in their housing production strategy. These are land use decisions that at the end of the day affect the math related to a city's capacity. And so these are separate from incentive-based production strategy actions like, say, MUPD, for example. So land use efficiency measures, some examples are rezoning land from a non-residential use to residential use, upzoning land from lower density residential to higher density residential, or doing development code amendments to increase the overall efficiency of the land, including like decreasing setbacks or increasing building heights, that sort of thing. So they differ from those other types of actions in that way. Not to say that financial incentives and other HPS actions can't be effective for promoting needed housing, but they don't necessarily increase the efficiency or the capacity of the land, which is really what is special about land use efficiency measures. So we've created a safe harbor for how local governments determine that they've done enough for the purposes of fulfilling the buildable land deficiency if they have one. So that's in in the draft rules in Division 8, Rule 150. Actions in a housing production strategy would still need to address all the needs identified in a contextualized housing need and go through the necessary compliance pathway for adoption. So I just want to make that distinction clear. But land use efficiency measures have a little bit more flexibility in terms of how they can be adopted. They could be adopted with the adoption of a housing capacity analysis or housing production strategy, or they could be adopted in a city's housing production strategy cycle by the midpoint review. So that would be 3 years in for metro jurisdictions. And then, of course, for non-metro cities, they just need to be completed before they do a UGB amendment, but that's not relevant here. And then I'll pause for questions after this before we get into development readiness, but I wanted to also make sure you all were aware of urbanization related draft rules that are also included in the Secretary of State notice. So I'm not going to go into detail on everything related to UGB expansions, exchanges, or urban reserves, because you all will not be the ones implementing these rules, but you certainly are still impacted. So you can find those rules in Divisions 24 and 21 if you are interested in reviewing. And I'm happy to also take questions in this meeting if you all have any. And then in Division 8, if you are a jurisdiction that has an expansion area that has been added to the UGB in the past 3 HCA cycles or 18 years, you will be asked to assess those areas as part of your contextualized housing need. And that'll look like assessing whether or not land in those areas has been annexed and zoned. And that will inform the actions that a city will take in the housing production strategy. So we'll be developing guidance early next year on types of actions cities could take to promote annexation and development in those areas. But yeah, I'm happy to take any questions before I keep going to development ready land. So I'll pause here. Are there any questions? Yes, Barbara, I think I saw your hand first.
Yes, I have a question. So that last point that you made about the lands that were brought into urban growth boundaries in the last 3 years or 15 years or 18 years or whatever it was, does that apply the first time that you do your HCA as well? Or is it just when you do revisits in the future?
When you're revisiting, yeah, if you're doing a UGB, it's for any previous UGB expansion you've done. So if you're doing one, if you're in the process of that happening as part of the current HPS cycle, that wouldn't be, if it's not yet part of the urban growth boundary, then you wouldn't be assessing it. But once it has been added to the urban growth boundary and you have been designated to plan for it, that's when that timeline would start. Does that make sense? I'm not sure I explained that well.
Okay, so kind of the opposite is my question. So if land was brought into the UGB, say 2014, and you brought many of the lands into your city limits,
Mm-hmm.
do you count that as when you do your first HCA, or is it when you do future HCA cycles that you look back? I guess I'm confused
I
about
see.
when you back.
I see. Yes. It would be if you haven't had 3 HCA cycles yet, it would just be within the past equivalent of 3 HCA cycles, so 18 years. So if you did a UGB, if there was a UGB expansion done in 2014, you would be looking to assess those areas.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Kola?
Hi. So two questions. I might have missed some of it, but so I guess going back to some of your beginning slides, but so the need is determined by, you said, DAS. And then do the cities still have like decision-making ability over the upzoning or UGB expansion? Because I guess the term that I'm seeing on the slides, the zoned to sufficient capacity, I'm curious if that, what that means. Like, who gets to determine that?
Yeah, great question. So in terms of the number of units and the divided up by income brackets, that part is uh, provided by the Department of Administrative Services.
Okay.
There are some local decisions that can be made in the contextualized housing need. That would be through local analysis, engagement with community members to determine what are those needed types
Okay.
and characteristics and needed housing locations. But in particular, housing types is particularly pertinent to the housing capacity analysis, because if you're needing more higher density housing, for example, that's going to affect um, uh, how you are meeting that through your zoning.
Okay. Okay. So the kind of that part of our process for determining how we're going to meet the need doesn't necessarily change. So it's still kind of that community engagement, engaging with our elected officials, like our elected officials, are you willing to upzone in these areas, or do you want to look at expansion? That's what I'm trying to, I guess, get at a little bit is, will we still have some of that authority to decide those things?
Well, and sorry, what jurisdiction do you represent?
Tualatin.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, metro cities don't have direct control over the metro UGB. So in this case, you would just be doing those land use efficiency measures and other actions in your housing production strategy, if you did have a deficiency of capacity determined in the HCA. And in terms of the exact actions, we don't specify in rule, you shall upzone in this way or rezone in this way. That is still flexible.
Okay.
But we do have a safe harbor in rule. It's optional. So there's still, I'd say, a lot of flexibility. Safe harbors are intended to provide that legal certainty. Um, so it would just be more of like opening yourself up to a little bit of legal risk if you chose not to do the safe harbor. But there is uh, still local flexibility.
Okay.
And then,
Thank you.
yeah, thanks for the question. And I'll just add one nugget as well, which is that we haven't quite gotten to the um, housing production strategy portion of the presentation, and there is some overlap between the requirements of the housing capacity analysis as it relates to a land deficiency and the requirement to take land use efficiency measures, and the actions from the housing production strategy perspective and the rules there, which are really agnostic or unrelated to whether or not there's a land deficiency, but with increased focus on those kinds of actions, the housing production strategy rules do offer compliance pathways for taking land use efficiency measures. And so when you sort of bring those pieces together, and perhaps we can revisit your question at that time, there is more state direction around those land use efficiency measures. Only one requirement, but there are additional, the remaining compliance pathways really encourage uptake of specific land use efficiency measures. So maybe we can return to your question at that time.
Okay, thank you.
Eric?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I guess I had a separate question, but just something you mentioned in response to the last question in terms of you, and I'm with City of Sherwood in the metro boundary. So UGB expansions versus the efficiency measures. If there's a match between the city's proposal and the regional need, would that, it seems to me like that would allow the UGB expansion to accommodate the need instead of just infill. Completely understand the UGB boundary is up to metro, but they do require a concept plan from cities in order to as one of the basis for granting UGB expansions and deciding where to expand. So can you elaborate on that a little bit? And if there is a match between the city and metro, how that would play out with the need? And then the second question is about the discounted capacity analysis for the land that's unlikely to develop. Can you just share a little bit more about what you're considering there? In my opinion, Metro did, for the first time in the UGB decision that they did in 2024, took a similar approach of really it was a pro forma approach to trying to figure out, are these properties actually going to redevelop? So if you can just share a little bit more about that approach, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, excellent questions. So for your first question on, the response to a land deficiency and the possibility of fulfilling that through UGB expansion if it aligns with Metro. State statute for, in particular, I think it's ORS 197A 355. Someone please correct me if that's wrong, but it outlines the process for what to do if there is a mismatch between needed housing and existing capacity. And it doesn't include UGB expansion or amendment for metro cities. And it states that if there is a deficiency for metro cities, you must fulfill that through actions or measures, in this case, land use efficiency measures. So I'm not sure that that statute would allow that, but certainly, I mean, there's coordination that could happen with Metro to align with local needs and goals. And in terms of your second question, I think I'm going to go back to that slide. Really the intent here was to, again, kind of reduce some of that phantom capacity that, we heard from jurisdictions cycle after cycle. They keep counting all this capacity and it's not developing after several cycles or after entire planning periods. A couple things. The land market supply factor is sort of a blanket. It's an option. It is not required, but you may use it to discount capacity of partially vacant land. The safe harbor is a discount of 10% for partially vacant parcels. And that is really intended to help reduce some of that analytical burden of not having to go parcel by parcel, because partially vacant parcels are especially difficult to inventory. And then that second bullet under discounting capacity, The thought here, and again, I'll go into a little bit more detail on development readiness and what that looks like, but essentially development ready lots are lots that are served with or readily served by with public facilities. But the thought there is that if those lots are inventoried as buildable land and they haven't developed or experienced infill over 12 years, 18 years, to not continue to rely on that for capacity, because there's probably something else happening that is outside of the city's control, and therefore it should be discounted. So that's uh, uh, the intent there. And in terms of the exact discount amount, there is a safe harbor to discount a third for, let me see, let me go back to my notes. To discount a third for each housing capacity analysis cycle that a development ready lot hasn't developed or experienced infill. And if not using that safe harbor, then local governments must discount capacity by 50% after 2 HCA cycles, so 12 years, and by 100% after 3 HCA cycles. Did you have any follow-up questions on that?
No, thank you. I appreciate it. And I also want to mention thanks, I guess, the legislator and also DLCD for administering the grant funding for some of this work. Appreciate it.
Great, happy to. Thank you. Laura.
Hi, Laura Turwet, City of Happy Valley. So in Happy Valley's case, we had a UGB expansion in 2002, so longer than the 18 years ago. And we have done concept plans for maybe about half that. And so there's a lot of land where there used to be Damascus and further than that, where there's nothing. My main question is, how do these rules identify where we need to do an HCA? So like what land are we actually analyzing? I'm sure there's other jurisdictions sort of that have this leftover stuff to deal with too.
Yeah, great question. We created actually a new definition in rule, and I think we probably need to do a little bit more cleanup of our draft rules, but we proposed a new definition for planning boundary, recognizing that some jurisdictions have different areas that they're planning for or tasked with. Especially in the metro region, we have metro counties who are specifically tasked with planning for urban unincorporated lands, which is outlined in House Bill 4063. And also recognizing that jurisdictions aren't planning for all land within an urban growth boundary, and not even just land within their city boundaries, but also may have other land outside their boundaries that, as long as they have an agreement in place that they are in charge of planning for that land, that would also be included as part of their planning boundary.
Just to note, we haven't even done concept plans for even out to our UGMA or our agreed area. So just something to put into the rules of figuring out how far out we plan, because it really is not going to be developed for a very long time because there's no infrastructure. So
yeah. Yeah, I think hearing that feedback is really helpful, and I would really encourage you to send that if you have any like technical suggestions, to send those via email, because I think that's really helpful as we work towards the next iteration of draft rules. I appreciate that. Teresa?
Hi, thanks. Teresa Cherniak. I'm a planner with Washington County. And I know that our representative on the RAC, Ann Kelly, has talked about this at the RAC, but I am concerned that, so I haven't read through all of the pages of the rules, but I'm not sure that they do recognize how different counties are from cities, and that you can't really just lump counties in with cities and have the same requirements. So things like annexations, we actually will lose area to annexations. We'll probably lose the most developable areas to annexation. So we may be left with a lot of land that's less developable. If we can't expand the UGB in our area, all lands added to the UGB need to be developed by cities. So UGB expansion won't do anything for county having to meet the needs that are identified. So I just want to make sure that as you're doing this, you really recognize that, and that maybe there are some different provisions worked in here for counties. And I think too, somehow along the way, we'll have our number that we're supposed to meet as areas annex and take our land area away. I think there'll also need to be a provision for our housing need to be reduced because we will have less of that land area. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa. That's very helpful to hear. And again, if you have specific suggestions, we're all ears. I
Yeah,
appreciate that.
and I just also will add that I know the question about how to adjust the methodology specifically for metro counties over time as lands are annexed is one that we are tracking. So, you know, we in partnership with the Department of Administrative Services and being that it's only been year one and really it's in the infancy of the rules even being live and applicable. That question hasn't been answered quite yet, but it is on the table. And we hope to bring something forward in the future with our agency partners.
Thanks.
All right, we'll go Barbara and then we'll continue on.
To build on Teresa's comment about urban county areas and annexing into cities, the more those areas are developed in the county, the less likely they'll annex into a city. You'll end up getting areas like Bethany, areas like Aloha in Washington County, where people are happy with what they have, and you'll end up with these urban unincorporated areas that are never part of a city. So I would caution DLCD in creating more areas like that.
Thank you, Barbara. All right, we're going to keep plugging along, but there will be more opportunities to ask questions. You know, I've alluded to this, but the development ready land inventory is a new concept introduced by House Bill 2001. So at the time a jurisdiction is required to do a buildable land inventory, they will now do a development ready land inventory. Buildable land, as you all know, is a term used to describe land within an urban growth boundary that is vacant, partially vacant, or redevelopable. And a jurisdiction is required to have a 20-year supply of buildable land for residential uses to meet their housing need. Development ready land, on the other hand, is a subset of buildable land, which is defined in 197A. And it really highlights the amount and capacity of land likely to be ready for residential uses in the near term. So that's in that housing production strategy cycle, 6 years for the metro region. And this includes land that is part of a city's boundaries or within the boundaries of an urban unincorporated land for counties that is zoned for urban residential development, served or readily served with public facilities or identified in a capital improvement plan and has committed funding. And lastly, development-ready land is not encumbered by constraints and has the necessary entitlements to prepare land for development. And development-ready land really intends to address a lot of the concerns we've heard about just inventorying buildable land, which is that buildable land inventories generally don't respond to land needs for near-term housing development. And development-ready land, on the other hand, is land that is served with infrastructure and is ready in the short term to respond to that housing production strategy target. And on the next slide, in terms of the draft rules for development readiness and how to operationalize what's in statute, there are new rules in Division 8 under 0180 and 0185. These lay out the process for how to go about inventorying development-ready land. And the draft rules really intend to clarify the statutory definition of development ready and how exactly terms like readily served should be interpreted. Development ready land is land that is quantified in both buildable acreage and in capacity-based estimates in terms of how many units can be served. And it also uses minimum density as the qualifier for development readiness. So for example, if public facilities are in place and they are enough to serve the minimum density of that zone, that is enough to be counted and considered as development ready, even if that's not enough to necessarily serve the maximum or even the achieved density of that zone. And in terms of how to measure sufficiency, a development-ready land that is satisfied when a city can meet their near-term housing production strategy target. And if there's not enough development-ready land, then a city will take actions in their housing production strategy to prepare land for development. And we've added new actions in our HPS menu to that effect. So I'll just pause again once more, but we do have several more slides going into greater detail of the Housing Production Strategy Program and model code. But I just want to make sure there are no more questions on this piece since it is new. And Eric, I see your question in the chat. Yes, happy to share the ORS reference, and we can send out a copy of this presentation which has that information. Anne, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm just seeing Celestina's second comment, a clarification for Teresa. I was wondering if Celestina means that there isn't potential to reduce our target or need as land is annexed by cities from us. So as our capacity shrinks, our target and need will not shrink. Or is there potential to reduce our need consistent with that? The expectation that our lands will be annexed by cities.
That's the question that's sort of clocked and on the table and has not been answered by the whole tri-agency initiative running OHNA. So my comment in the chat was only to respond to, I think it was Barbara's perhaps last note around how the program may sort of create established urban unincorporated lands, communities like Bethany, that then sort of de-incentivizes their annexation just by nature of the obligation for metro counties to plan for those lands, similar to cities. And so while I understand the comment, I just wanted to name that at the agency level, we can't control that portion of the work.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. Can I ask one more related question? And I don't expect it to be answered today, but if there is the potential to adjust our need and targets as land is annexed, what will happen to the contextualized housing need outcomes that we've determined for those areas? Like, would those also transfer to cities? And again, I don't expect an answer today, but just something to think about.
No,
Thanks.
it's a great point, Anne, and clearly that would be relevant information at the very least. Yeah. Okay, so let's transition now to the housing production strategy, which is a pretty smooth transition, as Jenna mentioned, particularly because the development-ready land work is sort of a bridge between the housing capacity analysis and the housing production strategy. And I'll touch on that in a moment. But just to recap, the housing production strategy is a citywide action plan to promote housing affordability and choice. And as noted on the slide, it's a comprehensive action plan. So it really takes into account anything that's within a city's control. And the obligation isn't only to promote housing production and affordability and choice, but also to do that in a way that responds specifically to the housing need that was identified in the contextualized housing need. And that is the work that was largely developed and adopted last year in 2024. And by that, I mean really cementing that obligation and the connection between the contextualized housing need and the housing production strategy and the actions therein, and really detailing to what specificity and commitment each local government is outlining action by action to include things like the timeline that the action will be completed on and the specific needs it intends to respond to or fair housing issues it intends to mitigate or resolve. So that was all established in 2024 to provide local governments with the structure and the framework for how to select actions in a housing production strategy. And additionally, how DLCD will be reviewing and what we'll be looking for in those housing production strategies. And then as Jenna recapped at the beginning, the goal for this year in 2025 was to develop, again, those compliance pathways for selection of the actions in the housing production strategy to offer local governments a little bit more certainty in compliance for that part of the work. So we will jump right into that on the next slide. So you'll see this almost identical concentric circle on the right-hand side that just reiterates that these compliance pathways offer compliance for a portion of any given obligation in Goal 10 work, while the remainder of either identifying housing needs or in this case taking action to meet needs, even if the compliance pathway actions don't meet all housing needs, that obligation still remains. So, and I should say in all cases, that obligation will still remain because the compliance pathway as drafted is really limited only to taking land use efficiency measures. So here's that bridge that Miranda mentioned and that others asked about. In the course of developing the draft rules, in considering whether the compliance pathway might apply to all kinds of rules, or I'm sorry, all kinds of actions, both land use efficiency measures and other things like local programming or system development charge fee structures or tax incentives and things like that. The current draft rules, version 2, propose that the compliance pathway, this more discrete set of actions and evaluation criteria, really be limited to land use efficiency measures, and that other actions be selected, still responsive to needs, and tailored and evaluated on that holistic level for affirmatively furthering fair housing and meeting those program obligations. So with that framing, we'll recap on the left-hand side for those actions that are in the compliance pathway. We have the same tools at our disposal, I might say, in terms of program design. So that includes the safe harbor, which means an action could be identified as a safe harbor for a local government to meet a certain need if they want to take that action, and there will be assured compliance. The rebuttable presumption that a local government is expected to take this action, but if it can be demonstrated that a different action would be more suitable to meet the need, then that could be acceptable. And then a minimum standard where the rules are just introducing a requirement for a particular action to be taken. And with that, we'll jump right into, well, what are the compliance pathways that are in the draft rules for the housing production strategy? So you'll see a similarly formatted table as we saw for the contextualized housing need, safe harbor, rebuttable presumption, and minimum standard in those columns, and then key needs that are almost identical to the key needs that are also provided for compliance pathways in the contextualized housing need. You'll see those on the left-hand side. And then similarly, in white, you'll see a sort of flag to the content of the action to meet each of these needs. So I'll just sort of name that one more time. So the key needs are on the left, and we know that the housing production strategy is an action plan to meet those needs. So that means that the compliance pathways are those actions to meet, in this case, the key needs that have been identified. And for most of the compliance pathways, except for just one minimum requirement around allowing density to be calculated by bedroom count in order to support larger household housing, all the other compliance pathways really base off of the model code. And so in a minute or so here, I'll be handing the presentation over to my colleague, Sean Edging, who's been working on developing that model code. But I'll just name for a moment here that at a very high level, you'll see the rebuttable presumption to plan for accessible, adaptable, and affordable housing with land use efficiency measures can be done through this rebuttable presumption compliance pathway tool by applying the model code incentives for that kind of housing. So in other words, when completing the housing production strategy, local government would either need to be applying those model code incentives or illustrate that a different type of land use efficiency measure would better meet those needs, accessible, adaptable, and affordable housing. And then for middle and multi-unit housing, you'll see that planning for middle housing and taking action to meet middle housing need applies a minimum standard to use the model code or equivalent standards on all land that currently allows middle housing. And that was what Miranda had mentioned in the chat. And then you'll see for multi-unit housing that the compliance tool proposed is a safe harbor, which means that a local government can take this approach or can take a different approach to meet multi-unit housing need and sort of be subject to review. But that if the safe harbor is taken, compliance will be assured by applying the model code or equivalent to all development ready lands and 50% of buildable lands. So you'll see that both applies the model code standard and adds an element of naming what lands should be allowing multi-unit housing to that standard. So that's a review of what the compliance pathways that are in version 2 are substantively and how they work. But since there's so much connection to the model code and the details therein, we're going to talk about that for a few minutes. So over to you, Sean.
Absolutely. And I have not, sorry, mine's going to be a little bit more text heavy, so apologies about that. But so I'll talk very briefly about the role of the model code. For context, for statutory context, the model code was originally envisioned as being part of the original Oregon Housing Needs Analysis, both to help inform Goal 10 implementation at the local level, as well as also a regulatory and enforcement tool as kind of the tail end of the housing acceleration program. Again, a tool to be rarely used, but one that was kind of available in the background if it was unable to reach kind of an agreement about the housing acceleration agreement. Of course, there's an entire rule about acceleration that I won't talk about here because that was the last year's effort. And in addition to that, there were two other bills that came on that added to that direction. One being 1564. This was passed in the 2024 session that directed us to produce very specific model codes by the end of this year for different size cities. And then Senate Bill 1537, which created the Housing Accountability and Production Office, which, among other kind of responsibilities, is directed to produce model codes to help support compliance with local housing laws. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the rule structure and how it kind of fits into that broader paradigm, all those different statutes that I've talked about. I'm not going to talk about the provisions in the code themselves. We've been in the midst of refining those codes over the past couple of months in response to both feedback from our work group as well as from local governments and developers. We had an outreach to solicit different case examples and refine it. That draft's going to be out and available on Thursday, and it'll be available for public comment along with the rule materials. So keep an eye out for that. But I'll be talking about the rule structure itself and just kind of those different kind of components or different functions of the model code itself. So if we can move to the next slide. All right. And I'll start with implementing Senate Bill 1564. This is just maybe a quick note. So as I mentioned, Senate Bill 1564 directed LCDC to adopt several model codes for different housing types for 3 different city sizes. 0410 does that. It implements and adopts those model codes. And that bill also establishes a new functionality for the codes, primarily intended for small cities, but available to any size city, which is the optional adoption and application by reference of a model code for one or more housing types. Basically, what the code does is it gives cities an option, an optional, a means of, say, if a city really wanted to support ADUs, for example, and let's say a city is particularly small and does not have a lot of capacity to undertake code amendments themselves, there is a version that is provided by the state that is designed that a city could take that, they could apply that by reference in areas that they specify, and allow ADUs in that means. And this rule basically specifies how that's done, where cities are able to do that, the types of things that they need to do, and keep in mind how it intersects with other regulations, things of that nature. If we can move to the next slide. It also has an intersection broadly with HAPO and in response to kind of complying with housing laws. So I'm sure any of the code experts on this call know that it's challenging to keep apprised of all the various bills that pass during legislative session, right? We are still unpacking the 2025 legislative session. I'm just about to deliver some guidance on that. But it can be difficult to do code updates. So one of the functions that we're building into 420 is basically establishing modules for model codes that local governments can apply directly where their maybe adopted and acknowledged code would otherwise violate a housing law. So an example of this would be the changes to the Middle Housing Land Division that are effective today, actually, as of House Bill 2138. No city's code conforms with this requirement, at least as of now that I'm aware of. And one of the provisions that's in the model code is a module for middle housing land divisions that cities would be able to use as an optional resource to comply with that housing law. Alternatively, they could also just apply the statute directly. We're actually using that same authority to use this model codes. And we actually intend to build on this over time with other model codes for other areas of state law, like by right affordable housing, mandatory adjustments, things like that. If we can move to the next slide. All right, fitting into goal 10, sorry here. It looks like the text formatting got a little messed up, so I'll try to make up for that. There are kind of two functions that are specified in the original organ housing needs analysis that are kind of operationalized in these two rules. So one is that Celestina noted that there were different kind of compliance pathways that local governments can take to demonstrate compliance with goal 10 requirements. And similarly, in the Housing Acceleration Program, there can be actions required in response to an identified barrier in that audit process. And in both of those processes, the model code can be used comparatively to local land use regulations. And what this rule does, and I'll spend a little bit of time unpacking this, is it allows when it's being used comparatively, it is not prescribing the exact standards that a local government has to apply in order to fulfill that requirement in either the compliance pathways or the acceleration program. Rather, what it's looking for or how it's to be used is to ensure that whatever local land use regulations are applied achieve kind of comparable development outcomes. And that means different things for different types of requirements. So for example, when it comes to siting standards, the model code includes different ways of regulating the floor area or intensity of buildings. And for the local government, that doesn't mean that they have to regulate it in the exact same manner, but that they allow a comparable building envelope that the model code allows, right? They allow a comparable kind of intensity of development as provided in the model code. Similarly, with design standards, it's not the exact same design standards that are in the model code, but rather design standards that have kind of comparable proportionate costs to the standards that are provided in the model code. And of course, when it comes to the incentives, which were mentioned, the accessible, adaptable, and affordable incentives, this is kind of a refinement from the previous version, that cities can establish their own programs that provide kind of comparable economic benefits to achieving these different outcomes. So the intent of this rule in particular is to provide flexibility to local land use regulations to achieve kind of comparable development outcomes where the model code is used for that purpose. And then finally, I'll just talk about this last rule. This is articulated explicitly in statute, but there were kind of some questions about how the application of it works. So I mentioned that there's a housing acceleration program, which is an audit process in response to identify and address barriers to housing production. Kind of at the very tail end of that process, the ideal is that local governments and DLCD would enter into a housing acceleration agreement that includes resources to undertake actions within a local government's control to facilitate housing production, affordability, and choice. And if that agreement basically isn't entered or abided, the kind of final step of the process is an LCDC enforcement order. And one of the tools that's explicitly identified is the direct application of a model code to development in that city. And so how does that work? That's what this rule identifies. Basically, how does it apply? When does it, in effect, what are the options that are available for, basically as a remedy? And then when does it, no longer apply when a city comes back into conformance? So that's what that final rule kind of articulates. So again, the draft codes, right, are going to be published on Thursday alongside of the other materials that are associated with administrative rules and will be available for public comment through November. And of course, also the rules themselves. So happy to discuss further about that intersection of these rules with Goal 10 implementation.
And with that, I think we,
yeah.
oh, go ahead,
sorry.
Sean.
Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't tracking the chat. So if there are specific questions that need to be addressed, let me know.
Yeah, I'll kick off questions now and I'll speak to the one that's in the chat. You're off the hook for now, Sean. It's not about the model code, but that's not to say that more won't be coming in. So please be thinking about questions, everyone. I don't know if you want to toggle to the next slide or not, Jenna, but I will speak to one question from Ariel Kane in the chat about whether the minimum standard to allow density calculated by bedroom was writ large or specific to affordable housing, and it was an accurate catch that it was not displayed as clearly as it should have been on the table. That is specifically for larger household affordable housing. So the requirement to allow density calculation by bedroom type for affordable housing development applications in particular. I will take this opportunity also to note, this isn't currently in the draft rules, but we've heard through some of our regional representatives, so perhaps from you all indirectly. With the introduction of some of these compliance pathways, the word affordable has been introduced in a way where the rules adopted last year really didn't use the word affordable and just specified affordability by income bracket. So it was more clear whenever we were discussing a particular housing need, it was either extremely low, very low, low income, moderate, income levels. And so we've heard that, and it's very fair. And we may be transitioning where you see affordable to language like extremely low, very low, and low income housing to really reflect that Oregon housing needs analysis methodology and the allocations and targets that are segmented by affordability bracket. So a little more than you bargained for on that question, but a little more information for you all there. Any questions about the housing production strategy compliance pathway, those specific actions to more or less invoke the model code standards to meet key housing needs, and that structure? Okay, we've got one in the chat for you, Sean. Are there parts of the model code that need to be updated now to reflect changes made by the legislature in 2025? I'm just wondering if we should wait to use it until that is done, particularly for middle housing.
Yeah, I can speak to this. So as part of the refinement process, we basically unpack those different pieces of legislation to ensure that the model code, to the extent practicable, could conform to those different statutory requirements. So you'll notice when you see this next draft, there'll be inclusions around, say, things like detached plexes, attached cottage clusters, right? There'll be bonus provisions that align with the bonuses in 2138. There's incorporations from 974. Senate Bill 974, which had some provisions around, say, like residential design standards. So a lot of those things have been incorporated. However, I think it's also important to recognize that rulemaking for 2138 is still upcoming. That will be led by the Housing Division, and we actually anticipate that the code will be refined over time in response to those different rulemakings, right? So that way we are ensuring that we keep the code updated in alignment with any rules that will be forthcoming out of that component. Now, I will say we're adopting the model code by rule now, right? So we have these provisions that are in place, and I would expect a refinement to happen to Division 46 is to allow the application of this model code for middle housing as an option. But that still is subject to rulemaking. But we would expect that as part of that process, we'll be updating the model code to reflect a lot of those changes that are happening as part of those different administrating rulemaking efforts. So so I would say the version that will be coming out on Thursday was vetted to better, basically align to the extent practicable with those different bills that came out of legislative session. We understand that there's still going to be rulemaking that can change them down the line, but the expectation is that this is a kind of constantly updated or a document, right? Like statutes are going to keep changing, right? As the legislature adopts bills, and we want to make sure that we keep this document updated in response to those. So.
Maybe over to you, Martha. Not hearing any follow-ups.
Thanks. I have a lot rattling around in my head about the model code, and I'm just going to try to articulate a couple things. And I need to spend some more time in the rules, but I'm admittedly a little bit confused about how this model code, what the relationship of this model code is to the middle housing model code that we are required to use or be less restrictive than in Division 46, because I don't think there's any changes planned for Division 46. And so I'm trying to figure out how you're reconciling a jurisdiction has to comply with Division 46, but then may have to apply this model code, which is different.
Actually not
And there
true.
must, go ahead.
So Martha, just really quickly, the model codes are outdated. They need to be updated to conform with House Bill 2138. There's a rulemaking directed as part of that. And part of that consideration will be how do you address and use different, like you have these two different model codes, how should that work? in light of Division 46 implementation? Should you establish a rule that lets you use that model code as just a verifiable safe harbor? Should you replace the old model codes with this new one and update it to reflect the changes in statute? That's a whole conversation that has to happen this coming biennium, right? So in terms of how the two intersect, we've been very careful in vetting this to make sure that it complies with the original version of Division 46 and also complied to the extent practicable with the changes from 2138. But we recognize that there's a rulemaking process that will need to happen in the future that grapples directly with that question. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm just not sure in the meantime which one we're supposed to be using. So, I mean, I guess unless we're making changes to our middle housing codes, we should be fine if we adopted them under sort of the old model code.
So the new provisions that are effective right now in 2138, they are there's an implementation deadline
Right.
of January 1st, 2027 or 2028 for cottage clusters, and cities can continue applying their adopted and acknowledged code in that interim period, right? I wouldn't recommend making changes based on the old rules because those are actually outdated. They're not consistent with the effective statute today, right? So I would wait for any potential changes until you're ready to make conforming amendments. And I would recommend tracking that rulemaking process carefully.
Well, and that's fair. And so just generally then, I understand if you end up in the housing acceleration program, the model code might be imposed on you. Like that makes perfect sense to me. I think that I do find it a little strange because when I read the model code, there are many instances in which the model code is actually more restrictive than our code. And so I think there's this assumption that the model code is somehow better than and less restrictive than local codes. And so I think that you'll have to be very careful how you are imposing it on a jurisdiction and really understand what it is about the model code that might be better. But I'm also, so that piece of it makes sense to me, and I won't talk for a long time, I promise. That piece of it makes sense to me. What doesn't make sense is that in the table that you had, when you're doing your housing production strategy, it seems like there's some instances in which you have to use the model code, some instances in which you have to either use the model code or do some sort of analysis that is maybe explained in the rules to demonstrate that what you're doing is somehow less restrictive. And I think that puts an extraordinary burden on jurisdictions to have to go through the model code and try to analyze all the pieces of it and why what you're proposing could be less restrictive. And I don't know if there's really any sort of sideboards put on that analysis. And then there's some where it's just a safe harbor, and that's fine. You could choose not to use it. And so I'm kind of confused how all this works at the HPS, the time of the HPS. And I don't want to hijack everything. Maybe I just need to spend more time looking at it and talk to you all offline. But I'm hoping I'm not the only one that's confused about this.
Yeah, Martha, and if I can just chime in here too, that rule that I mentioned that's explicitly designed to give local governments the flexibility to design their own land use regulations, that is the rule that describes what that process looks like. It is an option for cities, right? It's not imposing a mandatory burden of analysis, that type of thing. It provides an option to say, hey, city, you've indicated that your code, you think it's better, right, than the model code, you think it's less restrictive. Great, here's a pathway for you to do that, right? And so to the extent that those sideboards need to be clarified or parameters need to be provided, we're open to that. I think it's just that's the kind of venue to have that, right? It's like in that particular rule, how could that be refined to acknowledge, right? Like different codes are coming from different perspectives. In some ways, the model code does regulate things in a more restrictive way than some others, but also in other ways, the model code is very permissive too. We've definitely tested this along a lot of different codes that we've reviewed, as well as different actual development examples that we've been able to source from local governments and developers. So, I mean, to the extent that we can help refine that conversation and make it workable, we're happy to do that.
I think perhaps at its core, your question about the that comparative work, is present in using the model code as a benchmark or a standard. So long as, and that's really pretty core to the current draft rules. That's not to say that, we can't still continue to discuss that or unpack what that looks like. And as Sean said, what support is needed, or if there is a better approach. But that comparative work is sort of at the core of using the model code as a benchmark. Miranda?
Yeah, I'm hoping you can dive into this a little bit more, because reading through the rules, I don't see how cities have an option, at least one that isn't highly burdensome, because there isn't any specification to how cities take an alternative path. It says that that cities shall adopt the model code for middle housing, and it also presents the multifamily residential model code as a rebuttable presumption. So I'd actually like some clarification from staff, because reading through that, it does not provide really an alternative path.
Can we go back a couple slides? I think it's 420. Actually, no, it's 425. My apologies. So one slide forward. So this rule, and this is part of, I believe, part of the Secretary of State notice, so you should have access to this, discusses that kind of comparative use, right? So if we're talking about either in the acceleration program or in the compliance pathways, where the model code is used as a benchmark, saying like, you have to legalize middle housing, or you have to have standards, use standards in the model code for middle housing. It's not saying that you use those codes directly for your own local development codes. And this rule is what clarifies that. What it's saying is, when it's used for those purposes, either in the compliance pathways, in the acceleration program, wherever it's used in the context of Goal 10 planning, the local governments have the ability to establish their own local land use regulations, but the model code has some comparative bases to what is actually allowed in those local land use regulations. Specifically, that from when you look at the siting standards, for example, that the local land use regulations applied enable kind of comparative intensities of development, right? So the model code is designed to allow kind of a 3-story, as kind of designed around 3-story multi-unit wood framed apartments is kind of its benchmark, right? And it has parameters around how intensive that use is. And that would be what you're looking at. Are the siting standards conducive to achieving that kind of similar development outcome? When you're looking at design standards, right, the rule specifies that a city can apply their own design standards, but that they provide kind of comparative proportionate cost when considered against the design standards in the model code, right? So you can have different kind of things that you're shooting for, right? Maybe you have a set of design standards that are much more focused on aesthetics, whereas the model code's focused on pedestrian design, and it balances out because of these different proportionate costs that we're considering.
Yeah, but see, right
Hold
then
on.
and there,
I got two more. I got to explain before we discuss. The third one is around kind of comparative process by which housing can be reviewed by staff, right? So we're not necessarily saying that you have to use the exact procedures that are in the model code, but that you would not be, say, for example, sending all of your, multi-unit development proposals to a type 3 kind of quasi-judicial process, right? Like you have a comparative development process to review multi-unit housing. And then the fourth one is on bonuses. You have the ability to establish your own bonus structure for accessible, adaptable, and affordable housing, provided they have kind of comparable economic benefits, right, to what's provided in the model code. Basically, all of those allow cities to establish their own pathway for achieving comparable development outcomes, right? And the point of the code is to establish a benchmark, not prescribe a specific means of regulating development.
well, comparable development outcomes is not clear in the rules. So
it's discretionary because we're
right.
trying to provide
So
for
that's
flexibility.
problematic. Like the part of this was to create more certainty and clarity for cities through safe harbors, and not create this huge level of ambiguity that is now being created by this model code and these comparative analyses that have no clarity around them. And that
Miranda,
could
that's
change
also there
from
in the
review
code.
period to review period, or from city to city, or from an individual staff perspective. And
It's if I can use an analogy, there's a clear and objective pathway with a discretionary alternative. You have a clear and objective option, right? Which is you can use the actual provisions in the model code, and the answer is clear cut, right? But
it's
to
not
make for
necessarily better.
right, I'm not necessarily here to say that it's better. I'm here to say
Well,
that
but
there is an
that is what's being
there's a
done,
discretionary
essentially.
alternative for local governments to come up with locally innovative solutions, right?
That's essentially, though, what's being done by prescribing a model code.
Yeah, I don't know that Celestina, please. I see you have your hand raised.
Yeah. You know, I'm not sure that this is, I don't expect this to resolve maybe what you're raising, Miranda, but the model code sort of has a built-in rebuttable presumption tool almost. And so you'll see in the HPS draft rule language, there is rebuttable presumption language again, and that is really, but ultimately, the model code is already a rebuttable presumption, right? Because of everything Sean just explained. So anywhere the model code exists, it and in any way that it's invoked, it can be, somebody can say, actually, we're not going to apply the ordinance and the code directly, and we're not going to adopt it outright. We're going to illustrate comparatively that our code is less restrictive. So in terms of the compliance tools, which is more that I hear you might be getting at, Miranda, and I haven't heard direct feedback from you about a potential rule change, but if you think a different compliance tool should be utilized for those three portions of the housing production strategy rules, then that would be feedback that we would want to hear sort of in the direct application, because right now it's those three incentives, applying the incentives for affordable, adaptable, and accessible housing that are in the model code that are proposed in the draft rules as a rebuttable presumption. And it's those incentives and the equivalent development outcomes that would be subject to that rebuttal. So part of that is because those are really important housing needs. And so ensuring that that local standards are as flexible or more, or provide those development outcomes. There is a rebuttable presumption applied to really make sure that we're taking those housing needs super seriously, and the standards and the incentives that are available for those housing needs very seriously. So if you think a different compliance tool or approach should be used, now and over the course of the next almost month to the day is definitely the time for us to hear that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would be happy to share my opinions with staff. I think the issue that I wanted to raise for the people in this room is that it feels like in this presentation, I'm hearing that it feels like the presentation is making it sound like the model code is going to operate more like it used to, and that it is flexible, and that it'll be easy for cities to show that they have an alternative option, and that there's this alternative pathway, and that it will be an easy bar, that if you are truly exceeding the model code in ways, that your city should be able to easily navigate that process. And when I read through these rules, that is not what is presented in the language of the rules. And it is mandatory, essentially, during your next HPS to adopt this model code. There is no clarity on how you would go around showing that you even have an equivalent code, or that it surpasses in certain ways. And I am highly concerned about that. I'm concerned about that veering off from the legislative intent. So I just wanted more clarity on what that pathway would look like. I'm not sure that it's presented in the rules, and I'm not sure I had it here today. And I just want to raise that issue for other people in the room so that they can take a look at it for themselves.
Fair enough, Miranda. I just want to be really clear about what's in the draft rules, and the draft rules do not require that the model code be adopted at the stage of the HPS for any portion of it, I suppose, other than that the middle housing standards or equivalent are currently drafted as required. I think that maybe the spirit of your comment was that there is a bar that's involved that the city would have to meet, but I just wanted to be clear about those draft rules. But in terms of what is the comparative analysis work, that piece I'm hearing, you feel like there could be more clarity around, and so I think that we've got that feedback item for sure, and can chew on that. I wanted to see if anyone else had questions.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay. Will a local jurisdiction have to justify what it is doing if it is doing something other than the model code based on the pretty discretionary standards? If so, when would we have to do these analyses? Oh, sorry, I think that maybe there are a couple elements here that are unique, but it struck me as the conversation that we had just discussed. So at the stage of the housing production strategy, so this is the model code is representing code standards, which generally amounts to an action in Goal 10. So we're past the contextualized housing need. Needs have been identified. Local government is taking actions to meet those needs. In the current draft rules, the local jurisdiction would need to be, if they would like to retain their existing code for incentivizing affordable, accessible, and adaptable housing, because those needs and the associated model code incentives are drafted as rebuttable presumptions. It would be at the time of adopting the HPS and selecting those actions that comparison would need to occur. The local government would need to demonstrate that their code incentives would result in similar outcomes for those housing needs or better. So that's that stage, because for the safe harbor item, that's optional. So there's no way that the program would require that comparison. And then for the requirement for the middle housing model code to be applied and anywhere that middle housing is allowed, either the model code could be applied as it is, or at that point, if a local government were to retain their code, they would need to demonstrate that it is equivalently as permissive as the middle housing model code. So that's at the stage of the HPS. So it would be in HPS review that that action would need to be evaluated for compliance with the HPS rules. DLCD does have jurisdiction over approving the HPS and all of the component actions. We haven't gotten to the acceleration program slides, but maybe this is a good time to just click through them as I explain that portion of the program. So essentially, so hopefully that answers the question for the HPS stage, but I hear that there's a broad question of just when. So if a local government were to be in the housing acceleration program, a similar process might occur at that time. So one of the sort of checks in terms of what are the barriers that might exist locally toward housing production, affordability, and choice, and particularly as they relate to the referral into the acceleration program. One of those checks would be to look at the model code standards and the local government's zoning code and essentially treat the model code standards as low-hanging fruit to reduce or remove any barriers found in the acceleration audit. So hopefully, and that is also DLCD conducts the housing acceleration audit and pursues the housing acceleration agreement with the local government. So on the next slide, you'll just see that that is portrayed. We've got the housing acceleration program. One piece of that will be checking to see how the local code sort of sizes up to the standards in the model code on those same key needs and the that were present in the housing production strategy action phase, and the acceleration program more broadly, and all of the barriers that may come up and all of the potential local actions to reduce or remove those barriers are still part of the program. So thanks for letting me slot that in there. Did that answer your question, Teresa?
Yes, I think so. I think much will be revealed as we implement this.
Thank you. Not seeing or hearing any other questions, maybe this is a good time to review. Yes, thank you, Jenna. Some of the resources and support that is either already released or under development to support local governments in meeting this new Goal 10 OHNA housing program. So right off the top, you see the model code that we've been referencing. And really that's a subset of what we are calling adoption ready actions. So things that a local government can do that are pretty off the shelf, plug and play developed. That doesn't mean that anything is ever truly off the shelf, plug and play when we're talking about statewide resources and varying local governments, but across different actions that we've tackled this first go around at developing some of these resources. We have some that are developed pretty closely to the point of adoption readiness, and others that provide examples and templates and ideas and sort of next steps for local government to consider if they wanted to implement that particular action to meet their housing needs. And those will all be embedded essentially in the housing production strategy menu. So it was also mentioned earlier that that is being revamped. So you'll see it referenced as the HPS menu 2.0 here and there and in some of our meetings. And linked in the menu, so you could just sort of see an action that you might be considering, will be any resources that have been developed on that action, like those that are developed to adoption readiness. And you can just click on, you'll be able to just click on that and then review more about that action. We're also developing a guidebook, which is really a hefty guidance document about the how-tos beyond the rules, but some implementation thoughts and sample tables and templates and things for local governments to use in completing both the contextualized housing need and the housing production strategy. Of course, also available to consultants in supporting this work to help things be more plug and play for those local governments who'd prefer it to be that way. We've also got a mapping tool. This piece among all of the scope that I've mentioned so far really is open for input and feedback. It is offered here as guidance, and it's not, it doesn't have any direct like one-to-one regulatory requirement based on what the mapping tool may turn up about where local community assets are showing up in a community as compared to where some of the environmental harms might be. But it is something that local governments will need to look at and review in completing the contextualized housing need and making locational determinations in the housing production strategy. If there are other local conditions that are more that aren't represented there, that's also expected to be part of local government's locational understanding and locational choices in this housing work. But that mapping tool is under development, and we're interested in feedback on that. We've got the already launched housing production and housing equity indicator dashboards through our partner agency, Oregon Housing and Community Services. That one came up a little bit earlier on the call and is slated for updating over time, as many of our resources will be. Sean mentioned the same for the model code, but the dashboards will be refreshed with some bugs that have been caught, adding metro counties, and even some expansions to some areas where that may be possible at the beginning of next year and in years to come. And then the rules that we adopted last year also reference that the department will be launching sort of a one-stop shop web page with additional data sources and information where local governments can check to see if there's any other support, not something that's codified, a resource that's necessarily reliable over time or codified in rule, but that we have identified and is available, different data sets that might be developed over time. So that will also be available on the DLCD website. I see a couple of notes in the chat, so we've got a few minutes here, so I will put voice to them at least, and then get to our next steps. So we've got a request to help us review the code. Can we get a list of what professionals were involved in drafting and the precise steps that were taken to vet it? I think that we've definitely heard interest in DLCD providing some more support or clarity around how local governments can grapple with the model code standards. So I think that's something that we can include in further communications and thinking on rollout and implementation. So thank you for that comment. And then the next one, are housing production strategies that underwent adoption prior to, I'll just paraphrase, these newer rules, are those HPSs subject to potential acceleration program referral at their midpoint? Thinking yes, but curious about how they'll be measured against new rules when adopting under the old paradigm. And is the midpoint review when that referral becomes possible? So yes and yes. So the acceleration program is live. Those rules were adopted last year, and any refinements that are adopted this year will be live. So for any local governments who end up in the acceleration program, the department will still be looking to those standards as indications of potential local barriers, and that's sort of just the nature of the transition to the new rules, and from the Housing Production Strategy Program having existed previously. And yes, the midpoint review is when referral is evaluated. So just a couple minutes here. I'm glad to see, Martha, I see you have your hand up, but when I say a couple minutes, it looks like maybe 30 seconds. So I'm going to get to next steps here that Jenna has been mentioning, or Jenna has had the slide up to make sure that we put voice to that as well. You can, and we hope that you will, email us further comments. We've got our same housing.dlcd@dlc.oregon.gov email address. And please, if you can, give us some subject line indication specific to the OHNA rulemaking and these draft rules in your public comment. We have the LCDC public hearing later this month on October 23rd. We're hoping to get exact time confirmation soon, but it's looking like that'll be in the afternoon. After that, there's still public comment open for a couple of weeks, ending November 7th, and then the adoption hearing is slated for early December. So I'm sorry that it looks like a comment came in at the end here, and we still have one hand up, but unless it's a question about next steps, I think we'll probably wrap for today and hope to hear comments in writing elsewhere. Any other thoughts, Jenna or DLCD?
No, just thank you all for your time. And Martha, I see your hand. Really appreciate you all joining us today. And we'll be sending a follow-up email with some of these details that we've reiterated and in terms of, important dates and a link to those draft rules. I hope you all will provide comments to us via email. Those will be incredibly helpful as we refine the rules for the final version. But just want to thank you all again for your time today.
Thank you.
Go ahead, Martha.
Thank you. Oh, I just typed my question. I just
Oh,
was
okay.
wondering if I could get a list of which of the provisions from Division 7 were moved somewhere else rather than just repealed. Because the blurbs at the top are helpful, except they don't really indicate what happened. If it was, and maybe everything was just repealed. I don't know, but
It was all repealed. But I can tell you there was a lot of duplication between Division 7 and Division 8.
no,
So it
I
was
understand that. Yeah. I understand why it was done. I was just wondering if anything that was in there previously had been moved rather than repealed. Okay, thank you.
no.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.